Perfect. Thank you very much. So I'm now going to hand over to Philip, who will introduce our speakers this afternoon.
Well, thank you all very much indeed for joining us this afternoon or this evening, wherever you are. This is the third in our series of webinars on botanical gardens of the Commonwealth, and they proved hugely popular. In terms of just housekeeping points as we're running through the presentations, probably best if you turn your cameras off during the talks. There will be a chance for questions and answers at the end, so can you just submit them in the chat box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll either come to you or read them out when we get to that point. But I mean, today's presentations are a real treat at a site of outstanding architectural, historical and cultural significance. And I've known this site in particular for about 40 odd years. And in my view, without any question, it should be a World Heritage Site in its own right. And hopefully after hearing the presentations, you'll also agree. So this will be a double header with Dr. Maureen Bellego kicking off, speaking first on the gardens past and present, followed by Dr. Nolina Deblal on the exciting emerging Roxburgh House project, which the Forum, Commonwealth Heritage Forum, has shortlisted as a potential flagship project under our Queen Elizabeth II Platinum Jubilee Commonwealth Heritage Skills Training Programme. Rather a mouthful, but it's an immensely exciting initiative that we'll be launching on the 19th of May at the Commonwealth Secretariat in London. And the whole training programme is being funded by the Hamish Ogston Foundation. But let me introduce the speakers. Maureen is a historian and associate professor at the University Paris-Cité, and her research was really interesting, deals with environmental history, the history of science and imperial history, and particularly the historical dimension of spaces that are both natural and designed, such as gardens, and apparently also coastlines. And she's recently published a book in French on the history of the Botanic gardens in the 19th century. So a hugely important piece of research there. And following on will be Dr. Nolina Deblal, an old friend, and a conservation architect, an independent researcher, author of the intact listing of Calcutta's heritage buildings. And Nolina's research focus is very much on the construction history of Calcutta, spanning the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And she's also the programme director of the Roxburgh International Trust, the Scottish charity which is driving the Roxburgh project. So without further ado, really, if I can pass over to Maureen and you can kick off with the first presentation. Thank you.
Sure, thank you very much.
From Brittany as well, so thank you.
Yes, that's right. Thanks for inviting me. It's great to talk to such an audience. It's always very impressive to see that there are many participants. So I hope you will find it interesting. So let me share my screen. Can you see my slides?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. So this is just the cover of the book that has been published recently, last December, which is taken from my PhD thesis. So I turned it into a book. So there are many things I would like to talk about this garden, because it has been very interesting for me to research it, to visit it. And I think what I can bring to this, what I can bring to you today is the ways in which I found archives and turned them into a historical narrative. So I know some of you are experts on the garden, Adrian Thomas, for example, and thanks for being here. So I hope it will be a fruitful discussion. So one thing I would like to talk about is the proximity of the garden with the river, which is very interesting. And to some extent, it was the starting point of my history, the history I wanted to tell, because the story I tell starts with the 1964 cyclone that devastated Calcutta. So I chose this as a start because it was a total destruction of the Botanic garden. And I think the period that has followed this catastrophe has been overlooked by historians. So that's why I chose this starting point. And it's important that the garden was located near the river because it was regularly inundated. Right, and I'll go back to the importance of water and mastering water in the garden. So what I did is that I started going to the garden, spending time there, and I was lucky to have a very warm welcome from the librarians. So I'm very grateful to people in the garden for welcoming me and putting resources at my disposal. So on the top picture at the right, you see the library of the garden, which is situated in the Central National Herbarium, and which is very well kept. So I started finding interesting documents there, but I was also lucky in having the help of the staff of the garden with retrieving ancient documents that I found in another building of the garden. So you can see the picture, that's the picture below. Can you hear me properly? Yeah, I see that Jane, Corey, maybe you should mute your mic.
Yes, please mute. I will mute anybody that's not muted. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. That's working. Maybe Jane, if you hear us, you mute your microphone. Jane, Corey.
Hello.
Sorry, do you also hear the, let me check the chat. Yeah, okay. That's fine, yeah, that's working. You know, those things happen on Zoom. Right, so those documents, which I found in a disused building of the garden, were very useful in writing a micro-history of the garden. So what I found there were correspondences, documents that were related to a very day-to-day concrete history of the garden. So those papers for the administration weren't very important. That's why they weren't transmitted to central archival funds. But my history, the history I tell, is very related to what happened concretely day by day in the garden in the late 19th century. And it was interesting for me because there was an archaeological dimension to it. So the way I encountered things in the garden, so the Great Banyan, for example, or some difficulties that workers had, you know, to go from one place to another, even the difficulties I encountered because I was living in the garden. I was lucky to be able to use the guest house there as a researcher. And so I realized that it was difficult, for example, to get food. So I had to walk to Howrah, etc. And it was great. I really enjoyed this experience. But my experience of the garden related in an interesting manner to information that I found in the documents themselves. So, for example, the Great Banyan, I was really interested, of course, by this tree, which remains the main, I mean, you probably all know that this is one of the main attractions of the Calcutta garden. You go there and you just have to follow the flow of visitors to end up under its magnificent shade, although it's now it's forbidden to actually go under it. Unfortunately, I think it's a shame, but you know. So I found in those documents, in those abundant documents, I found information about this banyan and the way it was built by the British, little by little, as a symbol of what they were doing. So I took this as one example, one striking example of appropriation. So they encouraged its growth and counted their roots, for example. So it was managed. It was a managed tree, almost a built tree. So I inquired into this. I don't think I have much time to deal with this map. So let me focus on this map from 1895. And you see that the Great Banyan is actually one of the two trees that are actually present on this map, which emphasizes very much infrastructure. So that's an interesting map because the garden as it is today is actually very close to what it was, the way it was rebuilt by a man called George King in the late 19th century, as a place which was less dedicated to botany itself, but rather more as a display of what the empire could do in terms of managing landscape and nature. So lakes, for example, that's why I'm going back to the water problem. Lakes were a very important engineering element in this new design of the garden. And what I show with the sources I found is that managing water, making sure that the earth was not either too wet or too dry, was also an element of colonial discourse, which explains why the garden can be seen as a microcosm of larger imperial endeavors. It was supposed to be a showcase of what the British Empire could do in terms of managing nature. And it partly worked, but there were also many failures, and I also, of course, dwell on them because they are very interesting. So this is just to show you the guide, the 1895 guide of the Royal Botanic Garden, which tells us very much about the ways in which the garden's administration wanted people to see the garden, which is as a historical place through which could be seen the importance of British botanists. So in such texts, you see that botanical science is declared as something European, although the knowledge of Indians, the botanical knowledge of Indians, is recognized and sometimes praised by British administrators of the garden. However, British colonial administrators denied that local people did science in a rational way. So it's an ambiguous relationship with local knowledge. This is just to show you that the Great Banyan was one of the main elements in the map. And again, the question of managing water when you visit the garden today, I guess those who visit it regularly know that there is a problem with maintaining lakes, for example, because they get invaded by weeds. It's difficult to maintain them at the right level. And this is a problem that was mentioned in the sources already in the 19th century. And I found many documents about pumping, for example, and you can still see traces of this in the garden. When you walk around, you see many traces of this will to manage the height of water. And when you think of it, that was a very important element in colonial discourse, that the tropics, tropical or subtropical zones, were supposed to be unhealthy because of the difficulty to manage wetness, and disease, for example, was associated with an uncontrolled degree of wetness. So you can see how colonial ideology and the practical managing of water were actually linked, even in the discourses of the administrators. So it's interesting. I found information about the kinds of pumps that were used. So usually they were imported from Britain to Calcutta, and that created administrative problems because people had to ask for special authorization, etc. So that was an interesting story. So the proximity to the river is, of course, very interesting, because when you see this painting by James Fraser, it looks very peaceful, and it was sometimes. I also, this is a picture I have taken in the garden, so it's actually very beautiful. This river is magnificent, I think. But the problem was that it was difficult to maintain the territory of the garden. So I found it interesting to find this typo in a map from the 1970s, which says Botanical garden instead of Botanical, because it was not infrequent that boats actually ran aground or damaged the banks of the garden, or even in 1864, during the cyclone, a boat ended up in the garden. So I think maybe it was a meaningful typo. More importantly, perhaps, there was the problem of erosion. And so here you see workers actually trying to reinforce the banks of the river by using bricks and wire. So I found information about this in the archives, showing that actually this required a lot of workforce. This had to be very regular. So today it's very different, because actually the picture I showed you, this one, well, this is kind of misleading because you can't really, from the garden, you can't really access the banks of the river. You can't access it by boat any longer. I mean, you can go to Metiabrouge Ghat, I think, but which I did because I cycled from Calcutta to the garden once. But there is no ghat that leads directly to the garden, which I think is also a shame. But I don't want to criticize. I know it's difficult to maintain such a garden. But so this is another element of, you know, past and present. So, but to me, being in the garden was very much an encounter with the river as well. And I think this picture is interesting in many ways, also because you see two European people supervising. I'll go back to this thing. Maybe that's not relevant. Sorry, I'm trying to keep time, keep within the time limits. So another interesting point with the history of the garden is what it produced. And today it's quite different, but you see traces of this, especially in the buildings. So today there are many disused buildings in the garden. I think Nilina is much more expert about this than me, and we'll talk about them. But you see disused buildings, some of them were used for specific purposes. So one of these purposes was sorting out seeds and sending them. So this, I think, is a picture of, there weren't explained in the pictures, so I had to interpret them. But this was about sorting out seeds to send them. And indeed, the garden had a very important role to play in terms of disseminating botanical elements, plants, seeds, and specimens. So you have to think of the garden in the late 19th century as a center from where many things were produced and sent. And this was a major practical, technical challenge. So actually, most of the things that were produced in the garden, documents, seeds, plants, were sent locally to Calcutta, to Bengal, but rarely to other botanic gardens. If you look at the statistics, those international circulations were actually not the norm, but they were insisted upon, emphasized by colonial administrators, because international circulation was part of colonial ideology. And what I tried to do in my work was, in a way, relocalize the history of the garden, take for granted the way in which it served the colonial administration in Calcutta and in Bengal, rather than emphasizing the international networks. And this story is very important too. I think, for example, Lucy Brockway did very important work by showing the ways in which Kew Gardens, for example, and Calcutta were interlinked. that's absolutely important, but I shifted the focus a little, basing myself on the archives that I found. It's interesting, for example, to consider that the garden was produced seeds and that there were actually advertisements in local newspapers. So this is an ad from the Amarita Bazar Patrika. And one of the categories of documents that are very, very abundant in the archives that I found in the garden is plant indents. So that's a technical term to say papers that people sent to the garden, forms that were used to issue seeds to people. So it's very interesting because sometimes people, administrators, or even private people just asked the superintendent of the garden about what was more appropriate for such and such purpose, such as, for example, creating shade or using in a jail garden, because jails and gardens were very, very much linked, interestingly. We can go back to this perhaps later. And yeah, that's just the picture on the left is just to illustrate the importance of vegetables in jails. This was made in Alipur jail. The picture was taken in Alipur jail, and jail administrators were proud of showing that they could grow vegetables easily, and for this they asked advice and seeds to the Botanic Garden in Calcutta. So that's also a way of showing the local dimension and also the political dimension of the garden. Maybe the postcard is a bit anecdotal, so let's skip it. Also, something. Sorry, Rod Strong, could you mute your microphone, please? Create some noise. Thank you. I think it's better. So this is a picture of the garden's employees preparing cinchona for sending it. So when I was inquiring about the garden, I went to Mengpu, the place where cinchona was produced in the north in Darjeeling. And I saw that there, actually the presence of the Botanic Garden is still very important. So you can see in the former cinchona, where the place where cinchona was dried, you can see a list of the former superintendents of the Calcutta Garden. So it was, I mean, that was also part of the sort of archaeological way in which I lived this inquiry. And the garden was technically financially in charge of taking care of cinchona in Bengal, which is very interesting. So that's the quinine factory in Mengpu, which is actually a very, very beautiful and well-maintained building. Okay, that was just to mention briefly that the garden also sent specimens, and it's interesting to, I think Nilina will talk about that, but to see the evolution of the herbarium. So the way in which specimens were hosted, kept, shown, made accessible is also very much part of what you encounter when you visit the garden. It's interesting because administrators complained that visitors in the 19th century did not realize the scientific importance of the garden. So they went to see, nice plants and spectacular plants, etc., but did not realize that there was a herbarium in there. And it's still the case that it's actually not straightforward to, find your way to the Central National Herbarium. And I think people go to the garden to see the Great Banyan, which is great, I think. But it's still very much the case that the scientific dimension of the garden is hardly central to people who actually visit it. In one of the disused buildings of the garden, I found the cupboard with which is poison, Beige, right? And it's so the use of poison is amazingly important in the archives that I found, because it was absolutely necessary to poison almost everything that had to be kept for it not to degrade. So I found recipes of various poisons that were used to preserve documents. And so this was fractal. I mean, this echoed what I found, all the documents that had been discarded, because they take place in this history of producing things, preserving them, and managing their volume as well. Because the documents I found had been discarded because they took too much space. Right, so that was what I wanted to say. That's a silverfish. I was very lucky to be able to capture an image of a silverfish. They're actually quite beautiful. I think I'm going to stop here because I've spoken for 20 minutes and it's time to stop. So I will now leave Nilina explain to you many interesting things about the gardens building. Nilina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marie. Am I audible?
Am I audible? Yes, you could speak up a little bit more, Nilina.
Okay. Okay. Am I audible now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. All right. Thank you, Marine. That was fascinating. And I have to say, even before I begin, that you have many expectations of my talk. I'm afraid I don't have all that information for you today. So if I may share screen.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So just before I get going, I would like to say thank you to CHF, to the organizers, to Rachel in particular, for putting up with my demands and my frantic emails. I'm so sorry, but it's all come together. Thank you very much for all of you for making this event possible. I am extremely grateful. Thank you to all who have made the effort and taken time out to attend today. I know everybody is very busy, so thank you for coming this evening, afternoon, whatever time it is in your time zone. Many thanks to Marine for providing the background, saving me time and effort, and setting the stage very appropriately for part 2. I hope what I bring to all of you today matches up to the high standards set by Marine. Just a brief note before I begin. Some of you I have met before at my previous talk in November 2021. So you will know that I'm from Kolkata and feel quite invested in this place. Continuing in the same vein and with a desire to do things, to be active, to maybe hope to make a difference, the Roxburgh project has become a passion project for me, as it is for many others, for all of us involved in it. Sue, Sharon, Stuart, James, all the trustees of the Roxburgh International Trust, the CHF, the WMF, everybody who comes into contact with the project. The time we have today is not much, but I hope enough for me to convey some of that passion and make at least a little impact on all of you gathered here. The Roxburgh project. We are really at the very beginning of this project. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview of what the project is about. I'm not going to go into details of the history of the buildings of the garden today. We can always talk about that some other time. So I have to tell you a little bit about the story behind the Roxburgh project. It's a project that's been in the making for 15 years. 15 years. I think I first went there with a view to doing something in 2006. And I wasn't the only one. There were a number of us who for the last 15 years have been going to the garden, having meetings, discussing, trying to make something happen. And then over the period of about 10 to 12 years, there was a sort of a tacit decision taken that doing something about the entire garden was very ambitious. So we decided to focus on one portion of the garden as a catalyst, still very ambitious, but hopefully more doable. So this is where the Roxburgh project is based. That is the entire garden. And this is a more close-up view of the Roxburgh project area. Over 15 years, there have been many changes. This is the Herbarium building. You could still walk around in the veranda. That's me, 15 years younger. And this is what the Roxburgh building, the Herbarium building looks like now. So even the buildings are decaying. So there's an urgency. There's an urgency to get going with this project. But the perseverance paid off. And in 2018, the Botanical Survey of India formally sought a proposal. And in October 2019, lo and behold, there was actually a proper agreement that was signed that the project could go ahead. This was a eureka moment, because for the government of India to allow private participation was a huge deal. The parameters are that we will be more or less allowed to undertake the project without Public Works Department interference. Those of you who know anything about India will know how difficult the PWD can be. The flip side of it is that the funding has to be sourced from outside of the Botanical Survey of India. But that's fair enough, because if we take money from them, then we have to accept the PWD sitting on our heads. So that's where we are now, 2019, October, this agreement was signed. But we all know what started happening in November, December 2019. From February, COVID set in, and from March, we were under lockdown. So things have been very slow in the last 2 years, but we have been inching forward. And we are now at a point where we have a trust to drive the project. And hopefully 2022 will be a good year. So so normally when talking about something like this, you describe the project first, and then you talk about why it's important. But I think for the Roxburgh project, it's the why which is really very important. The project itself is a catalyst. The project itself is the vehicle for going somewhere. Philip talked about the immense historic importance of the garden, and that it should be a World Heritage Site in its own right. So I'm not going to go into that, but I'm going to talk a lot more locally. And this is where actually, because I'm local, I look at it locally. I look at it at ground level. Why is this project so important? First and foremost, crying need for open space. So this dense development that you can see is the Kolkata metropolitan area, this urban agglomeration. That's Calcutta, this is Howrah, then you have Serampur, Chinsura, Chandanagar on this side, you have Kollani on this side. It's extremely dense. You can hardly see any green area. And in the middle of this, we have this 273 acres, which is the Botanical Garden. It stands out because it's one of the few contiguous green areas of that site. The rest of it is completely built up. This is to give you an idea of the depletion of open space just in Calcutta, 2005, I think, to 2020. I can't see the masthead, so please excuse me if I make a few mistakes. For some reason, the bar is not disappearing. No. This is the South City area. Those of you who are familiar with Calcutta will know this is what it used to be in 2005. Green, a lot more water, still dense, but still a lot more green. And this is what the area looks like now. Very typical of development all over the city. The city is gasping. Declining open space is trapping pollutants. Whatever little parks there are, it's like this, it's a dust bowl. Because it's the same place where toddlers play, where old people sit, and where the youngsters play football and play any games. There is no space in the city. And whatever, again, something of what there is, there's always the authorities, there's appropriation by the authorities. This is a largish green area, which has been appropriated by them. I don't know under what laws and what rules. They're building this multi-story car park with a commercial complex on top of it. And that's what it looks like now. It looks like a scar, a blot on the landscape. The trees are gone. So And yet, on the other hand, we have 273 acres of the garden. This is on a winter day, no doubt, when things were just opening up after COVID, but still, it's a heavily underutilized garden. If Marine thought it was crowded, she's not seen what crowded can be in Calcutta. And I'll show you a slide of what crowded can be in Calcutta. So it's underutilized, it lacks facilities, people standing around, there's no place to sit, there's no shade, there are no refreshments, there are very few toilets, they're scattered, in remote corners of the garden. People don't come anymore. I used to go there as a child. We used to go there as a family when I was a child, but haven't been there on a day's outing in years. So that's the open space. For me, the open space is actually one of the biggest reasons for doing something about the garden, making it accessible, bringing it back into the public eye. Then next is conservation. In Calcutta, those of you who know Calcutta, is full of extant buildings of an earlier era. There's the KMC listed, graded list of heritage buildings, which is about 1,000 buildings. This is one on that building, but there are many, many more like this. And the Roxburgh project is about conservation, conserving an ensemble of the 3 heritage buildings, hopefully setting benchmarks and showing the way in the field of conservation. Guidelines for heritage owners of heritage buildings, very few and almost non-existent. There's no guidance on how to approach conservation. It simply says that you have to get something done by a conservation architect, and that's it. There's no requirement for study. There's no requirement for proper reports. So we are hoping that with this project, we'll be able to show the way. We'll be able to carry out an exemplar project. Skills training. This is master mason or headmistress on one of our sites. There are very few. We all know, we keep crying about lack of skills. And this is a lady helper. In fact, one of the key aims of this project is to upskill women, because traditionally on building sites, the women are the helpers. The master masons are always men. So we are keen to try and upskill women as part of this project. Then conservation as a driver of sustainability. In Calcutta, the building sector is the greatest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, much more than transport. We keep talking about transport and emissions from buses and taxis and cars, but actually it's the building sector which is the biggest contributor to GHG. So that's another very huge, very good reason for pushing up the profile of conservation. Then we have climate change. Marine talked of the cyclones. This is the impact of the Amphan cyclone in May 2020. Thousands of trees devastated, thousands. This is underneath the Great Banyan tree. One pocket completely destroyed. It's just become open to sky, one pocket. They are still trying to clear up after the Amphan cyclone. So as Marine said, not only by location does it make it a very good laboratory for climate change awareness, but by mandate, because the garden comes under the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. So by mandate, the garden this would be a valid way forward. Then income generation and stakeholder aspirations. There's much that can be done in this domain. Right now, the surrounding area, which you saw in the beginning, very dense populace, very densely populated. It's like an us and them situation. So there's lots of work that can be done over here. Education, Marine mentioned. It's true, people come here for the novelties. They come here for the monkey ball tree and they come here for the banyan tree, but they don't actually realize the educational potential of this garden. More nuanced narratives. Again, Marine touched upon this. More nuanced historical narratives can come out through this project, through the research, which will be undertaken as part of this project. And a leisure destination. This is what crowded is in Calcutta. This is the zoo, it's 46 acres, it's in the holiday period. There isn't an inch to move. So this is what Calcutta is about. So we desperately need to make that space work. We desperately need to make the botanical garden work. So what is the Roxburgh project? The Roxburgh project envisages restoration and reuse of the riverside ensemble of 3 heritage buildings, outdoor workshop spaces, ferry connecting with Kolkata, so Marine, maybe that will gladden your heart, and landscaping of the surrounding area. This painting Marine showed, so this is the Roxburgh house. This is going upriver with the Botanical Garden on the left, Kolkata on the right, and that is Roxburgh for you. The Roxburgh house, it is proposed to be reused as a historical museum, conference center, library, and a memorial garden in the surrounding spaces. That's what the building looks like today. This is just a few shots of the building. This is the riverside view of the building, and that's an internal view. These were taken some time ago. This staircase photograph, it's now even more precarious. One can't go up the staircase. Then the second of the buildings, which is the Old Herbarium, which is this beautiful, graceful building built in the 1890s in the tenure of George King, who Marine mentioned. Right now, almost derelict. It was said to have been modeled on the extension to the Kew Garden Herbarium. And these are a couple of photographs of the interior of the herbarium when it was in use. This is when when you could still access the inside of the herbarium. These photographs were taken some time ago. Now you can't go inside, and a lot of this wrought iron cast iron has actually disappeared, sadly so. That's the underbuilding on the right, and those are the old cases, specimen cupboards, which were still there some time ago. And that's the third of the buildings, which is the seed store. So possibly, Marine, the photograph that you had of sorting seeds was actually over here, outside the seed store, because these are the louvered shutters, putting 2 and 2 together. Okay, and then there is the outdoor recreational and workshop spaces to be built with bamboo and thatch, low cost and sustainable, airy, leisure areas, and last but not the least, the ferry connection, we are hoping, between the garden and Kolkata. And that's a sort of reconstruction aerial view of what it's going to look like. Who's the team? Botanical Survey of India, of course, because it's their property. The Roxburgh International Trust, who's the charity, Scottish charity driving the project. Simpson and Brown and Alia and Associates are the 2 architectural firms, the lead consultants who have been pursuing this project for the last 15 years and who have made it happen. Potential partners, Commonwealth Heritage Forum, as Philip said, and we are hoping to have the World Monuments Fund on board as well. And acknowledgements, Simpson and Brown Architects Edinburgh and Alia and Associates for the use of photographs, drawings, and information from the report submitted by them to the Botanical Survey of India in 2018. And let's make it happen together. And that's the river. You never go far away from the river. And for me, it's hypnotic, the river. I know there's a barrier, but that's what it's all about. So we need help. We are starting our fundraising for this project. And please reach out to us if you have any ideas, suggestions for how we can go about it, who we can talk to. We need seed corn funding to begin with, and then of course, bigger funds later. But seed corn funding to get the project off the ground. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to hand back to Philip, who'll go through the questions. We've had a few questions in the chat. I think the first one, I'll just scroll back through, was from Naomi about how to access information on the Calcutta Botanical Garden archives for her research. I don't know, Naomi, if you're there, if you want to expand on that. No, so shall I put that question to you, Nalina? How can I access information in the Calcutta Botanical Gardens archives for her research. From
I think
Naomi.
Marine has turned on her mic. So Marine, why don't you answer? Because it's really your domain.
I can do that.
Thank you.
So Naomi, you can write to me if you want, and I can give you some information about how to find archives. Let me just write email in the chat. Oops, sorry, that's right, here we are. Yeah, I mean, the papers that I have found in the garden, I think have been destroyed now, unfortunately, but I have some pictures of them, maybe they could be helpful. Otherwise, in the British Library, in the State Archives of West Bengal, which are very important too. So I can help you, by email. We can do a Zoom on this, depending on what you need.
Can I raise another question that's in the chat box, also from Naomi, rather off the wall one, but it says, does Bengal have beige coloured raspberries? Beige when they're fully ripe, which have a hot, spicy taste. I ask because my Calcutta-born and raised grandmother had such a raspberry bush in Dublin. I've never come across such raspberries anywhere else and wonder whether she might have taken it to Dublin from Bengal. Anyone know the answer to that one?
Yes, there are. We do have beige colored raspberries and they're very tasty. So does that answer?
Good, that's fine. I mean, there's a few comments, but I mean, basically just being, a few very supportive comments. But does anyone want to, who may not necessarily put something in the chat box, want to make any points at all? Comments, observations, questions?
Okay,
James.
I think Bonani has put a question in the chat box.
Ah, okay. Well, sorry, I saw James, you had your hand up.
Okay, James.
Want to comment, and then we go to Banana. Okay.
I would just like to say huge thank you to Marina, who's I've just borrowed a copy of your book from Jane Corrie, and it takes a long time to read in French, but I've thoroughly enjoyed what I've read so far. A whole new story. My interest has been in the origins of the garden. William Roxburgh became the superintendent in the 1790s of the house and so on from that time. I just want to say thank you. And I want to say thank you to Nilina. We've been involved together for a long time, Nilina, and it's really very, very exciting to see this project so well expressed, and looking forward to real progress, and I hope we get huge support from lots of people. This will be very important to Calcutta for all the reasons, quite apart from the science of botany and the history of the garden itself. And so, all the very best. Thank you.
Thank you, James. There's one more in the chat box before we go to Stephen Green, who's got his hand up, but from Banani, actually.
Yes.
The question is to Nalina. Banani, do you want to ask? Yeah.
I can just go from the question in the chat box. So Bonani very rightly brings up the question of central government versus state government. So the Botanical Gardens comes under the central government, Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. And so the strained relations between the center and state are certainly an issue, though I see a very encouraging comment in the chat box from the MLA for Dokhin Howrah. Thank you very much, Mr. Chaudhary, I think, Tapun Chaudhary I saw. I shall get in touch with you. It's very heartening to see support from any quarter. So I think we can overcome that, Bonani. So let's see. Fingers crossed.
Can we go to Stephen Green, who's got his hand up?
Hello.
Hi.
Right, sorry, I was just sorting out my video and microphone. I've got two questions actually. One relates to the documents. I know Marie mentioned that some of the documents have been destroyed since she looked at them, and I seem to remember that from seeing an earlier a webinar about the project, that there were quite a number of documents stored, I think, in the basement of Roxburgh House, and I wonder what's the position with those. Have they all been lost, or is there any possibility of anything more being retrieved and rescued and conserved?
Thanks, Stephen. Sorry, Nilina, do you know anything about them?
No,
No, okay.
honestly, I don't. No.
Well, I think I should have looked in the basement. No, I don't know. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to know what happens with documents, but this should be inquired about. Thanks.
So the documents that you saw, which have been lost,
yes,
where were they located?
They were in a building that was next to the guest house, not very far from the guest house in the south of the garden, which currently says Non-Gazetteered Staff Association. It's a red building. You know, Nilina, you know it, right?
I know which building you mean. Yes.
And it's called I think it's red, right? So yeah, yeah.
Okay, thanks. I have a separate short question for Nilina relating to the lack of open space. Certainly here in the UK, accessibility of open space and parks, etc., particularly for people living in urban areas, has really come to the fore through COVID, and I wondered if that was a similar experience over in Calcutta.
Well, in fact, Bonani, who's here, will know this very well. During the COVID period, actually parks were shut in Calcutta because we had so little open space that there was fear of overcrowding. I mean, it was a bizarre situation, absolutely bizarre. So in fact, a corollary to this is the question of carrying capacity. So in fact, this question did come up that, you know, if we create a destination, if we enhance the usability of the gardens, what happens? What is the carrying capacity? The thing is that carrying capacity will come much later. As you can see right now, just making it usable is the first step. So yeah, so we had a very bizarre situation in Calcutta with all the parks shut right through the COVID period.
Yeah, that was to a little extent true in our very first lockdown, but more recently it changed. But thanks, and good luck to everybody with the project. It's absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.
Can we? I think Adrian wants to say something, so over to you.
Thank you. Well, I was going to say it's terrific to see so many people gathered online who've got an interest in the Botanic Garden, and I hope there'll be a list or something made available to Nilina, because I think many of us would like to continue supporting what she's doing, and I really admire her taking the initiative.
Thank you.
I was going to ask just a question about the symbolism of the Roxburgh house, which has such a rich history, and one can just imagine the superintendent standing on those battlements. And I don't know whether you've ever actually managed to get up to the top. I haven't, I don't think. But you can survey the whole garden, and you know, part of it was all about surveillance. You could also survey the river, and you could see the ships coming up and down, and some of them were bringing botanical specimens, and there are references to this in the correspondence. So I hope, you know, it's not just going to be about restoring the fabric, but also helping us to understand this wonderful building.
Certainly, Adrian, certainly. So it's, you know, that's why, so it's really in early stages, but the brief is evolving. But as I said, there is definitely, interpretation is important. So, you know, there's going to be one, there is really, actually, there are no museums, no interpretation centers of this entire, what happened. And so we are actually currently thinking of maybe doing it in two parts, the historical part in the Roxburgh house, and the more recent interpretation of the botanical research, climate change, these issues in the herbarium. So it's evolving. The brief is evolving. I don't want to, give it a very hard and fast structure here now, but just talking of the top, yes, there is a staircase. There's a spiral staircase by the side of the building, so you can actually go quite a bit to the top, and the view of the river is magnificent. I tried to locate a photograph today to show what it looks like from up there, but I couldn't find. I just have so many photographs all over the place. I couldn't find the river photograph from the top, but it's magnificent.
Yeah.
Philip, may I reply to Adrian and just say that I've sat and had lunch on the roof up there. We had a distinguished visitor. Nelina will remember who it was. I've forgotten, and it was spectacular. I remember we had plates full of pineapples and various things, and the view is absolutely wonderful. Who was it?
That's great.
I don't know. There have been many visitors, so let's leave that for the present.
A great experience. Supriya, you wanted to ask something?
Yes, I had a question that I put in the chat box, in fact. Thank you for both those fascinating presentations and moving too for a resident of Calcutta, and all strength to Medina for this project. But the question related to Maheen showing us the sale and distribution of seeds from the garden. What is the continuing related to Agri-Horticultural Society of India with its headquarters in Alipur and with space in the Botanical Gardens, or at least they were given space at one time in the Botanical Gardens? They are still quite a prosperous body. What relation, what continuing relation do they have to the Botanical Gardens? And, I'm thinking of Sidney Percy Lancaster and the kind of work that he did in the 1880s and thereafter, the setting out of the Sundar Nursery, the planting of Delhi avenues, and so on. So, on the one hand, there is a body of work from colonial times, which seems to be preserved in quite good order. And on the other hand, the botanical garden in decay, as we can see. So what is this relation? Could you please clarify on that?
Thank you very much, Supriya. It's great to hear your voice again after some time. Well, I have to say it's a very interesting question, and I don't feel very well equipped to answer it. I know what you're talking about the. I think maybe Adrian would know more about this. I don't know. I mean, what I noticed is that there seems to have been a sort of divergence of the garden and the Horticultural Society, Agricultural and Horticultural Society of India in the late 19th century, because, for example, I encountered some papers where there were about seed distribution, of course, and it was about who could get free seeds from the garden. So the garden stopped issuing free seeds to people in the 1870s, approximately. They tried and then continued and stopped. But they said, this is for the Agri-Horticultural Society. So people who want seeds should stop asking the garden and rather turn to the Agri-Horticultural Society. So I think there was a sort of public dimension to the garden that was less important in the society, something like that. That it's a different, they played a different part in the administrative structure. And I think the garden was considered as something completely public. They didn't make any profit, for example, on the seeds they were issuing. That's interesting in itself because, for example, I think the Singapore garden was different, the next talk. Yeah, I hope it's not a complete answer, Supriya, sorry, but maybe that kind of helped a little. Adrian, do you know anything about it?
Yeah.
This is Bonani.
Bonani, yes,
Bonani.
I was just wondering, Bonani might be able to enlighten us.
Yeah,
Yes.
sure.
Yes, thank you. Yes.
Yeah, Supriya, to answer your question, the horticultural gardens in Alipur, it's not at all prosperous anymore. They charge people just to go walking. Huge numbers of morning walkers go there at the cost of damaging some very, very rare trees. They have paved for the walking path right up to the roots. And there's the garden, the horticultural garden used to have flower shows. They used to sell seeds and plants. Nothing like that happens now. It's in a terrible state right now, and there's no connection with the botanical gardens.
I'm very sorry to hear, because there is a very rich history from 1820, when the Agricultural Society was formed, and all the work of very significant colonial gardeners. And I'm particularly thinking of Percy Lancaster.
Sorry, can you speak up a bit, because I don't think people can hear you.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
So I'm thinking of Percy Lancaster, who was at the Calcutta Botanical Gardens and then in Lucknow, and he was in Delhi, and he was responsible for the laying out of the nursery, which is still present. I just wondered about, and it's very sad to hear what you say, Bonani, about the present state.
It's a very bad situation right now.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'll just pick up a couple of questions in the chat box along the same lines, actually, to both Lena and Maureen. I mean, one is from Selena Fox, who said, are we getting any support from the Natural History Museum in London? And along similar lines, are we receiving any support from Kew Gardens? Do you want to comment on that?
Regarding Kew, yes, we are setting up a dialogue. We started a dialogue with Kew. So it's happening. We're just kind of crawling out of the post-COVID scenario. I'll be very honest with everybody here. We are desperately in need of seed corn funding. Desperate. So please, any avenues that you can think of, not for the bigger picture, but just to get to put some of the pieces of the puzzle in place, to put the pieces on the chessboard. So any ideas, any suggestions? Very welcome.
Ramita, do you still want to ask something?
You're on mute, Romita.
Yeah, sorry, I just unmuted myself. Fabulous presentations. Marina, I actually heard you speak at the Kew conference on botany last year. And Milena, I remember you very much from my school days. Brinda and I were in the same class together. So speaking of seed funding, I immediately thought of the Paul sisters, Priya and Preeti Paul, because especially Priya has been so involved with Tasveer Ghar and giving quite a bit of her time and I'm sure generosity towards the visual arts. And I wonder if she could be convinced to think about her home city of Kolkata and heritage conservation projects like this, which might kind of extend their portfolio out a little bit, especially since they're involved with the Fleuries, revival of Fleuries and also Oxford. So I wonder if they might be willing. People like us who have local roots in the city are much more keen to hold on, to embrace these spaces and really to see them come back to life. It's just a wild hair, but they are billionaires, so maybe it's worth approaching them.
Right. So Romita, two parts to your question. One is about the Paul sisters. Yeah. I can talk to you about Priya and Preeti separately, but I'll just tell you that Priya is also a board member for WMF, and WMF is actually showing a lot of interest in the project. WMF India. Okay. So we are already very much involved, but that's WMF. Regarding Indian diaspora all over the world, yes, that is what we are really trying to target, because I think that they'll be able to feel what it is that we are trying to say. So maybe we can get in touch with you separately, and it would be fantastic if you could help brainstorm and help us pull together a list.
Sure. No, this is keeping all fingers crossed, because one of the things that came out from both your presentations very effectively was the larger history of Calcutta as a garden city. And the Botanical Garden really represents the kinds of gardens that did exist before, perhaps not on that grand scale, but the idea of green spaces disappearing, you know, sort of these hauntings that we now have of trees being removed from different kinds of city spaces themselves. And many of us have seen even how the neighborhood of Alipur has changed with all the garden homes giving way to multi-story buildings, right? And I'm thinking about all the gardens along the Hooghly, if one were to think about the morphology of the river landscape. You've got the botanical gardens. We also have the gardens of the Governor General's estate, right? We've got Barrackpore, downriver. So we've got, you know, a series of interesting spaces. And frankly, as we both know, having and lots of other people who are here who grew up in Kolkata, you know, none of these spaces are really included in our syllabi at the school level. So there's a profound lack of awareness of what the local history of Kolkata is all about, aside from the Tagore family and, you know, the usual suspects. We are not taught about the landscapes of the city as such, you know, who went up and down these rivers, right? And Maureen, going back to your point about seed exchange, I'm thinking all the way back to the 18th century. In a way, the Kolkata Botanical Gardens, and this is something I remember Jordan Goodman sort of putting into my head very early on, actually predates Kew in terms of being a seed exchange garden, in terms of being a plant exchange garden. Kew takes that role on more in the Victorian era, right? But from the moment this garden is set up in the 18th century by Robert Kidd, we immediately see it functioning very much along the lines of what Sir Joseph Banks is imagining, right? And envisioning with economic botany. So it is huge importance globally as well as locally. So I wondered if you had any thoughts about this. And I know Adrian is also online here. Hi, Adrian, nice to see you after many years. If both of you had any thoughts or responses to the local, the global, and also the educational potential. And I know, Nilina, you're beginning the project now, but I really hope, like the banyan tree, it grows many roots and extends itself out into the city schools, because the next generation is really the keeper of our histories, right? We can do as much as we can now, but they need to be involved and be proud of their own city spaces. Thank you.
Thank you, Romita. It's very interesting. And it's very important to remind us that the garden was, the Calcutta garden preceded some of Kew's actions. That's really important. And you're right, it was large scale, it was international. I was also trying to see that if you take the quantitative approach in the 19th century, most of the seeds actually went to Calcutta itself or Bengal. And that the international dimension was emphasized by colonial administrators, and that historians have tended to repeat this. It's not contradictory, but just I wanted to make this point that the garden was rooted locally, and you know, there is this trend of global history at the moment. There has been this trend for about like 10, 15 years, which is interesting because we study transnational phenomena, etc., etc. But my point was also that it's worth trying to study a particular place very, very closely, you know, in order to study local phenomena. So that was part of my endeavors. So, it fits. And I think I should have emphasized what you were talking about a little more. So thank you for reminding it to us.
Right. I'm conscious that we're sort of over time a bit here, but I'm reluctant to cut short a very interesting and stimulating discussion. But before I thank the speakers, can I just say that I think we can finish on a positive, upbeat note, and that we have put into our first year programme with the Hamish Ogston Foundation the possibility of putting in the CCOR money that is needed to get the project moving. We'll know more about that by the time of the launch on the 19th of May. And as I say, I've been promoting very strongly that this should be a longer term 5-year project with drawing in funding from a variety of different sources if we can get the ball rolling. So everything to play for. And if I can thank you both, Maureen and Lenina, for just an absolutely fascinating presentation for somewhere that we're all very passionate about, that is in desperate need of partnership, care, attention, and repair and restoration. One final point for Maureen is that you've got a sort of huge amount of knowledge there, which would be really useful to share with the Roxburgh International Trust, actually, as part of the wider background to not just the buildings, but the gardens themselves. So hopefully this is the beginning of a productive relationship between you and the Trust. So thank you all very much indeed for listening in. I hope it's been interesting. I've certainly found it absolutely fascinating and encouraging that there's such interest, not just in India, but more widely here in making something happen. So little round of applause, I think, for both the speakers, if we can do that virtually or thank you very much.
Philip, just before you go off, I think did John intend to, oh, is that a bye? Okay. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Philip.
So thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip. Thank you for sharing, and
Thanks
you
for
to
inviting
Peter, and thanks, Marie.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us. Okay. Bye.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.